The palace doors close softly, yet for the young women inside, the sound is final. In the heart of the Han Empire, beneath layers of ceremony and splendor, an unspoken system decides their fate. Behind these lacquered walls, a world of strict hierarchy and silent obedience governs the lives of hundreds of concubines, girls chosen not for love, but for their usefulness to imperial power. Most were teenagers. Some were taken from distant provinces. Others were gifted to the throne like tribute. And once they entered the inner palace, they became property of the emperor, watched, ranked, evaluated, and prepared for rituals few outside the court were ever meant to see. Today, we uncover the horrifying secret rites that shaped their existence, rituals the Han court documented with chilling precision, yet later dynasties quietly downplayed or erased. Records reveal strict examinations, nights of selection, and ceremonial purifications, overseen by eunuchs whose loyalty belonged only to the emperor. Witnesses describe these rites as both sacred and brutal, formalities masked as tradition, but designed to maintain absolute control over the bodies and futures of these young women. For centuries, official histories softened the truth. The suffering was hidden behind poetic titles and sanitized descriptions. But the fragments that survived, memoirs of palace attendants, early dynastic chronicles, and archaeological evidence, tell a far darker story. This is the world the Han emperors built. A world where silence was survival. A world where one misstep could end a life as quickly as it began. But first, understand the world that made this possible. This documentary is intended purely for educational and historical purposes. It explores sensitive themes, including coercion, ritualized control, and the lived experiences of vulnerable individuals in ancient court systems. Some details may be disturbing, though all are drawn from documented historical sources and presented with respect for the victims involved. Viewer discretion is advised, particularly for younger or sensitive audiences. In this episode, you'll learn how the Han imperial harem was structured, a rigid hierarchy that determined every aspect of a concubine's daily life, from where she slept to whether she was allowed to speak in the emperor's presence. The secret initiation rituals young concubines were required to endure, including purification ceremonies, inspections, and ceremonial preparations documented in early Han court manuals. What contemporary sources reveal about the individuals who enforced these systems? The eunuchs, palace officials, and attendants whose power often rivaled that of the emperor himself. How these practices shaped not only the lives of the concubines but the stability of the empire, influencing succession, palace politics, and even major historical crises. Why later dynasties attempted to obscure or soften these accounts, and how surviving records, some fragmented, some intentionally altered, allow historians to reconstruct the lived reality of these young women. These learning points guide our investigation into one of the most tightly controlled and least understood institutions of the ancient world. Step inside the inner palace of the Han dynasty, around the 1st century BCE, a world sealed off by walls, protocol, and fear. The emperor rules as the son of heaven, and his harem, known as the Hogong, functions as both a political institution and a breeding ground for imperial succession. Within its ranks are hundreds of women, from high-ranking consorts who influence state affairs to young concubines with no power beyond obedience. Their lives follow a strict hierarchy. Every movement is recorded. Every privilege must be earned. Even their interactions with other women are governed by protocol. While the outer world sees the palace as a place of refinement and privilege, those who lived inside described it as a place of quiet competition, constant surveillance, and rituals that reinforced imperial control. This is the world a new concubine enters, often barely 14 years old. Upon arrival, each girl is assigned a rank. The majority become liangren, low-level concubines whose role is simply to serve and be available. Only a few rise to titles such as Meiren, Baolin, or Furen, each carrying increasing privileges and dangers. Higher status granted visibility. Visibility attracted political rivalries. Lower status offered safety, but also anonymity, and the constant threat of being discarded. Every concubine's day begins long before sunrise. Palace attendants arrive with lists detailing where each woman must be, what tasks she must perform, and whether she may attend grooming ceremonies, music lessons, or the nightly rituals in which selections for companionship are made. Eunuchs monitor adherence to these instructions. Violations, even unintentional ones, are punished through demotion, isolation, or confinement, penalties recorded in palace law codes. What appears to be a domestic hierarchy is, in reality, an elaborate system engineered to maintain control over women who could influence the empire's future. A favored concubine could give birth to the next emperor. A neglected one could vanish into obscurity. Thus, the Han court created rules to prevent alliances, limit friendships, and enforce obedience. Concubines were forbidden from forming private networks, and letters to their families were censored or intercepted. The palace was also designed physically to enhance this control. The harem consisted of multiple walled courtyards, each sealed and guarded. Movement from one courtyard to another required written permission. A concubine who wandered into a restricted area, even by mistake, risked severe punishment. These measures prevented any interaction not approved by the court and ensured that the emperor alone would dictate which women held influence. For the emperor, this system guaranteed order. For the concubines, it meant that their lives were determined by rules they did not create and could not challenge. Contemporary sources provide glimpses into this confined world. The Book of Han, Han Shu, describes the harem regulations in precise terms, outlining ranks, punishments, and the role of eunuchs in enforcing discipline. Fragments attributed to palace attendant Lu Xiang describe concubines who lived in fear of missteps, noting that a single violation could mean exile from the palace. Archaeological finds from Han burial sites, including inscribed bamboo slips, confirm the strict bureaucratic oversight that governed even minor palace routines. These records, though sparse, reveal a life shaped entirely by imperial expectations. The structure of the Han harem mattered far beyond palace walls. The selection, treatment, and control of concubines shaped imperial lineage, influenced political factions, and contributed to major conflicts, such as succession disputes that destabilized the dynasty. For the young women themselves, these systems transformed personal identity into imperial resource. Their value was measured solely by obedience and the possibility of bearing sons. This rigid hierarchy set the stage for the secret rituals they would later endure. But the hierarchy was only the surface. Beneath it lay initiation rites, ceremonies the empire recorded but never fully explained, rituals designed to bind these young women to imperial authority from their first night inside the palace. Before a concubine could be fully admitted into the emperor's inner household, she was required to undergo a series of rites known in Han records as palace purifications. These rituals marked the transition from ordinary subject to imperial property, and they were treated with the same seriousness as ceremonies involving state officials. Conducted in secluded chambers within the inner palace, the rituals took place shortly after a concubine's arrival, often within hours of being presented to palace authorities. Young girls, unfamiliar with court protocol, faced a battery of procedures overseen by eunuchs and senior palace women. The rites reinforced a single message: from this moment forward, their lives were no longer their own. Although presented as sacred tradition, these ceremonies served a deeper, more unsettling purpose. They ensured the emperor's absolute control long before any personal encounter ever occurred. The initiation began with a ritual cleansing, not a bath but a symbolic washing carried out under strict supervision. Records indicate that multiple palace attendants were present, each with assigned duties. One to recite ceremonial formulas, one to document observations, and one to verify the girl's physical condition. The process reinforced hierarchy from the outset, every gesture dictated, every movement monitored. After cleansing came the examination stage, which Han manuals describe in unusually clinical detail. Senior palace women evaluated posture, composure, and obedience. Eunuchs verified compliance and recorded assessments on bamboo slips. These examinations were justified as measures to protect the emperor's health and maintain palace order, but they also served as a test of submission. Any hesitation, any sign of distress, could result in a concubine being marked as unsuitable, a label that effectively ended her prospects within the palace. Then came the ritual that historians consider the most psychologically devastating, the night of presentation. Contrary to popular imagination, this night did not always involve the emperor. Instead, it often consisted of rehearsals, formalized practices in which concubines were instructed on posture, speech, and the silence expected in the emperor's presence. Palace women demonstrated the required gestures. Eunuchs enforced them with uncompromising precision. For many young concubines, this rehearsal was indistinguishable from the real event. They were forbidden from asking questions. They were forbidden from expressing fear. The performance had to be flawless, even though few fully understood the implications of what they were being trained to do. These rituals created a psychological environment in which obedience became instinctive. By the time a concubine completed her initiation, she had already been reshaped into a role the Han court deemed acceptable: disciplined, silent, and entirely dependent on palace authorities. Descriptions of these rites appear in several early texts. The Han-ji, Records of the Han, refers to chambers of purification, where new arrivals underwent tests of virtue and tranquility. The scholar Ban Zhao, in her treatise Lessons for Women, indirectly references these expectations, noting that palace women were required to display quiet obedience and ritual stillness. Bamboo slip archives recovered from sites in Hubei mention presentation nights, during which attendants documented a concubine's conduct and demeanor. Although none provide a complete picture, together they reveal a systemized, state-sanctioned ritual designed to ingrain obedience from the moment of entry. The initiation rites were not merely tradition, they were instruments of imperial power. By imposing these ceremonies at the outset, the Han court ensured that concubines entered palace life with diminished agency and increased dependence on palace authorities. These rituals also reinforced the emperor's divine status, emphasizing that any privilege afforded to the concubine, attention, rank, or protection, was entirely at his discretion. The psychological imprint of these rites shaped the rest of a concubine's life, influencing her behavior, prospects, and survival within the harem. But the initiation rituals were only the beginning. To understand their full impact, we must examine the people who enforced them, officials whose authority often eclipsed that of the concubines they controlled. Inside the Han imperial harem, young concubines rarely interacted directly with the emperor. Their daily reality was shaped instead by an intricate network of palace officials: eunuchs, chamber attendants, senior palace women, record keepers, and inspectors, each serving as extensions of imperial authority. Eunuchs, in particular, occupied a uniquely powerful position. Because they could not produce heirs, they were considered safe guardians of the harem. This perception allowed them unprecedented access to both the emperor and the women under his rule. Some eunuchs rose to political prominence, others operated in the shadows, controlling movements, punishments, and information flow within the palace. For a new concubine, these officials became the gatekeepers to every aspect of her existence. They determined when she slept, how she behaved, whether she advanced in rank, or whether she faded into obscurity. Their influence was absolute, and their power often exceeded even that of high-ranking consorts. Each day began with a morning register, an administrative ritual in which eunuchs recorded a concubine's compliance with palace rules. These registers documented attendance at grooming sessions, lessons, medical evaluations, and ceremonial practices. A single infraction, arriving late, speaking out of turn, failing to perform a gesture correctly, was noted and could affect a concubine's prospects for months. Eunuchs also supervised the selection evenings, nights during which the emperor, or his chief attendants acting on his behalf, chose which women would be considered for companionship. Concubines were arranged by rank and appearance, and their names were recited in a predetermined order. A eunuch's voice determined who would be seen and who would be ignored. This power made eunuchs central to palace politics, and concubines often felt compelled to curry their favor, despite strict prohibitions against private interactions. Senior palace women enforced discipline among younger concubines, teaching them ritual protocol and punishing breaches of etiquette. Punishments ranged from isolation in quiet chambers to enforced fasting or demotion. While the official justification was the maintenance of harmony within the harem, these measures reinforced subordination and dependence. Even intimate aspects of the concubine's life were supervised. Movements between courtyards required written permission from eunuchs. Letters home were read, copied, or quietly withheld. Medical examinations were documented in palace records. Nothing occurred without oversight, and nothing was forgotten. This machinery of control served a dual function. It protected the emperor from scandal or impropriety, and it ensured that the internal dynamics of the harem remained tightly regulated. For concubines, it created an environment where trust was scarce, privacy non-existent, and survival dependent on perfect adherence to ritual behavior. Accounts from the period reveal the extent of this administrative apparatus. The Han Shu, Book of Han, includes detailed lists of palace positions, noting that eunuchs were responsible for monitoring the women's conduct and preserving order within the chambers. A biography of the famous eunuch Zhao Zhong, written during the Eastern Han, describes the immense influence senior eunuchs wielded over imperial appointments and over the emperor's private life. Archaeological discoveries at Zhangjiashan, consisting of bamboo administrative slips, document daily palace routines, including attendance logs and punishment codes for concubines. Together, these sources confirm that palace life was governed by constant surveillance. The dominance of eunuchs and palace officials shaped not only the lived experience of concubines but the political trajectory of the Han dynasty itself. By controlling who gained the emperor's attention, eunuchs indirectly influenced succession, alliances, and court factions. For concubines, dependence on these officials created profound vulnerability. Their survival hinged not on imperial affection, but on the discretion of those who monitored every detail of their existence. Yet even under such scrutiny, the most consequential events lay ahead, moments when imperial politics collided with personal fate, reshaping lives in ways the records barely dared describe. By the height of the Han dynasty, the imperial harem was more than a private household. It was a political engine capable of determining the empire's future. Every concubine, regardless of rank, became part of a system that could alter alliances, trigger rivalries, or even shift the balance of power at court. The emperor's affections were not merely personal. They influenced succession, shaped policy debates, and provoked conflicts among powerful clans. The harem's internal struggles often reflected broader tensions within the dynasty. Ministers watched carefully to see which woman gained the emperor's favor. Clans maneuvered to place daughters within the palace. Eunuchs attempted to expand their influence by controlling access to the emperor through the women he trusted. Though individual concubines had little agency, their fates nonetheless carried immense political weight. And many of the darkest stories from the Han harem reveal patterns that appeared again and again across later dynasties. In imperial China, concubines were often the unwilling participants in political strategies orchestrated by powerful families. Placement within the harem served as a means to influence imperial decisions or elevate the status of entire clans. Some families trained their daughters for years to improve their chances of selection. Others offered them as tokens of loyalty. But once inside the palace, political protection vanished. High-ranking consorts such as Consort Qi became targets of rival factions, accused of improprieties or treasonous ambition. Lower-level concubines, lacking powerful sponsors, were especially vulnerable. A rumor whispered by a eunuch, an accusation made in anger, or a perceived expression of displeasure could result in demotion, isolation, or erasure from palace records. Political crises frequently spilled into the women's quarters. During succession disputes, concubines associated with rival princes faced interrogation or confinement. Some were pressured to support a political faction by providing information about the emperor's mood or private conversations, despite strict laws prohibiting such disclosures. Refusing could be fatal, participating could be treason. Similar patterns emerged in later dynasties. During the Tang period, several concubines were executed after being implicated, often falsely, in plots involving court officials. In the Ming era, harem women were purged during internal investigations into corruption among eunuchs. Although separated by centuries, the structure remained consistent. Concubines bore the risks of political conflict without possessing the power to influence its outcome. The cost was not confined to the palace. Families of disgraced concubines could be punished or stripped of rank. Some were forced into exile. Others saw their entire household collapse because a daughter fell from imperial favor. What began as a system designed to secure heirs had become a battleground for imperial control, with concubines trapped at its center. Historical chronicles provide vivid accounts of these political entanglements. The Ziji Tongjian, a comprehensive history compiled by Sima Guang, documents multiple cases in which concubines were implicated, fairly or not, in court conspiracies. The Book of Han records the downfall of Consort Qi, describing how political rivals manipulated palace gossip to eliminate her influence and secure their own. Tang Dynasty court diaries, preserved in later compilations, recount episodes in which concubines were executed during purges of eunuch factions. These sources reveal that the dangers concubines faced were not personal misfortunes, they were embedded in the political fabric of the empire. The experiences of concubines offer a crucial lens into the instability and volatility of imperial China. Their treatment reflected the centralization of power, the fragility of succession, and the influence of competing factions. Although many remain nameless in official histories, their stories illuminate the cost of empire building. Young women sacrificed to systems designed to protect political elites. Understanding these dynamics reveals how deeply human suffering was woven into the machinery of governance. Yet the darkest truth remains: much of what concubines endured was intentionally obscured. To uncover the full story, we must examine how later generations tried to erase it. By the end of the Han Dynasty, court historians faced a dilemma. How much of palace life should be preserved for posterity? Imperial chronicles were expected to record events faithfully, yet they were also instruments of reputation, crafted to elevate emperors, justify their actions, and glorify dynastic rule. The lives of concubines, especially their suffering, posed a political problem. Many rites and punishments were deemed too controversial or too damaging to the imperial image to appear in official records. Court historians therefore employed a well-known strategy. They wrote selectively. Details about concubines' initiation, discipline, and political involvement were softened, abbreviated, or omitted entirely. Euphemisms replaced harsh realities. Ritual coercion became instruction. Punishments became corrections. Deaths became removals. As later dynasties looked back on the Han period, they inherited not the unfiltered truth, but a carefully curated version of it. And for centuries, this sanitized narrative concealed the deeper suffering of the women whose stories remained locked behind palace walls. The mechanism of hiding concubines' experiences began with the imperial archives themselves. Documents concerning palace rituals were often classified and accessible only to court officials. Chroniclers drafting the Shiji or Han Shu worked under political pressure, mindful that excessive criticism of an emperor could lead to punishment, or worse. As a result, descriptions of life inside the harem appeared in vague, formalized language. The women were instructed, the rites were completed, order was maintained. Some records were intentionally destroyed. During times of political upheaval, especially at the end of the Western Han and during the transition to the Eastern Han, archives were moved, edited, or burned. Documents detailing internal palace affairs were often the first to disappear, dismissed as irrelevant or dangerous. Yet the most profound erasure came from the voices that were never allowed to exist. Concubines could not write memoirs. If they did, they rarely survived. Letters were censored. Personal reflections were discouraged. Their lives were documented only through the perspectives of eunuchs, officials, and historians, outsiders who rarely prioritized the women's experiences. Over time, later dynasties reinforced the silence. Confucian scholars viewed discussion of palace women as improper. Official histories focused on emperors, generals, and ministers. The harem was relegated to the margins, treated as a symbolic institution rather than a human one. But fragments survived in unexpected places. Bamboo slips buried with mid-level officials. Medical records kept by palace physicians. Moral treatises written by women scholars like Ban Zhao, who hinted at the expectations placed on palace women. These shards of testimony, scattered across centuries, form the basis of our modern reconstruction. The truth persisted, not because it was preserved, but because it could not remain buried forever. The Han Shu contains passing references to harem management, offering brief but invaluable clues about discipline and hierarchy. The Zhangjiashan bamboo slips, uncovered in the late 20th century, include administrative notes describing palace inspections and punishment codes. Ban Zhao's Lessons for Women provides indirect evidence of the behavioral expectations imposed on palace women, emphasizing quiet submission and ritual obedience. Later compilers of the Ho Han Shu occasionally preserved anecdotes about court scandals, stories likely drawn from oral traditions rather than official archives. Each of these sources, though incomplete, contributes to a mosaic of understanding long obscured by imperial silence. The erasure of concubines' experiences had lasting consequences. It distorted historical understanding, obscured the human cost of imperial rule, and allowed later interpretations to romanticize palace life as refined and elegant. Modern scholarship challenges this narrative, revealing a darker, more complex reality built on control, vulnerability, and political exploitation. Recovering these stories does more than illuminate the past. It restores agency to women whose voices were suppressed by one of history's most powerful institutions. Now that the hidden truth has been reconstructed, we can step back and examine what this story reveals about power, suffering, and the fragile nature of historical memory. Across the vast expanse of the Han Dynasty, the lives of concubines were shaped not by choice, but by an elaborate system designed to regulate their existence from the moment they entered the palace. Their stories, reconstructed from fragmented records and scattered accounts, reveal a world where power operated quietly, through ceremony, obedience, and fear. We uncovered how the imperial harem's hierarchy dictated every privilege, every punishment, and every possibility for the young women who lived within its walls. We examined the initiation rites that transformed them from daughters of distant families into instruments of imperial continuity. We explored the machinery of control, eunuchs, attendants, registrars, who enforced discipline with meticulous precision. And we saw how political ambitions, rivalries, and succession struggles turned concubines into unwilling participants in conflicts far beyond their control. Finally, we confronted the centuries of silence that followed. Later dynasties softened the record, historians avoided uncomfortable truths, and the voices of the women themselves were lost to time. What remains are fragments. Yet even these fragments speak clearly of a life defined by ritual, surveillance, and vulnerability. Why does this matter today? Because history is not only the story of emperors and battles, it is also the story of those who had no power, whose suffering sustained the structures of empire. Reconstructing the lives of Han concubines challenges the sanitized image of palace life and reminds us that behind ceremonial splendor often lies human cost. The truth survived because it mattered, because understanding these women's experiences deepens our understanding of the systems that shaped ancient China and, in many ways, the world that followed. Their stories may have been hidden, but they are no longer forgotten. If you made it to the end of this story, comment Han Palace Truth below. It helps this hidden history reach more viewers. Tell us where you're watching from, and share which part of the Han concubines world surprised you most. Your insights help guide future investigations into forgotten chapters of the past. And remember to subscribe for more untold historical truths that challenge what we think we know about ancient empires. Next time, we uncover another dark and censored story, one buried even deeper beneath the official record.